Get out. He threw his partner out at midnight, but the most feared alpha mafia boss brought him home. The most feared alpha in Seoul was already soaked to the bone when he crouched down in the middle of a rain-drenched road, pressed his suit jacket against a stranger's bleeding head, and said 4 words that no one in his organization had ever heard him say before. Stay with me, please. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to 11:58 p.m., to a Mapo apartment, a mug of tea going cold on a kitchen counter, and the exact moment Gerald Shin's entire world ended without a single raised voice. He heard the door open. He didn't look up right away. 3 years together, and he still knew Kang Do-yoon's footsteps by heart, that particular rhythm, confident and unhurried, the walk of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged somewhere. Then he caught the scent. It hit him before logic did. Another Omega. Young. Unbonded. And already wearing Kang's scent like a second skin. Gerald set the mug down. Very carefully. The way you set something down when your hands are starting to shake and you refuse to let anyone see it. Kang didn't apologize. Didn't stumble over an explanation. He simply walked to the door, held it open, and looked at Gerald with eyes that held nothing. Not cruelty, not guilt, not even the ghost of 3 years. Just absence. I need you to leave, Gerald. Gerald Shin had survived his heat cycles alone, graduated top of his architecture cohort, and quietly held that apartment together while Kang climbed every ladder he could find. He had never once begged for anything in his life. He picked up his coat. He walked out. And somewhere in the cold dark of a Mapo crossroads, with 12,000 Korean wons in his pocket and a dead phone and the rain coming down like the sky itself had something to say, the headlights found him. If you've ever loved someone so completely that losing them felt like losing your own address, this story is for you. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because what happens next between Gerald Shin and the most dangerous alpha in Seoul is the kind of story you will not want to miss a single second of. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from, and share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Now, let's continue. Gerald didn't see the black SUV until it was 3 feet away. He didn't hear the brakes until it was 2. He didn't feel the impact until it was done. What he felt next was a hand, massive, steady, pressing something warm against the side of his head. And a voice, low and roughened like gravel dragged across cold stone, cutting through the rain and the ringing in the dark. Don't close your eyes. I said don't close your eyes. Gerald Shin had never heard that voice before in his life. But somehow, impossibly, it was the first thing in hours that sounded like it meant what it said. Kang Do-yoon had been rehearsing this moment for 11 days. He had run it through his mind the way he ran financial projections, methodically, without sentiment, trimming every variable that didn't serve the outcome. He had chosen a Tuesday because Gerald worked late on Tuesdays, which meant the apartment would carry the familiar smell of Gerald's drafting pencils and cold coffee, and Kang had decided, with some precision, that familiar things would only make him hesitate. So he had told Shin-Roo to arrive at midnight. He had switched his phone to silent at 10. And when he finally turned his key in the lock at 11:58, he had already closed every door inside himself that needed closing. He just hadn't accounted for the mug. Gerald was standing at the kitchen counter when Kang walked in, still in his work clothes, sleeves pushed to the elbows, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea like he was trying to absorb its warmth through his palms. He didn't look up immediately. That was so entirely Gerald, never rushed, never rattled, always occupying a room like he had quietly earned the right to be in it. Kang felt something move in his chest. He let it pass. He was good at that. Gerald looked up when the scent reached him. Kang watched him process it in real time, the slight stillness, the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, the moment his Omega instincts identified what his mind was still refusing to accept. Another Omega. Here. On Kang's collar, in Kang's car, standing now in the hallway just behind Kang's left shoulder with his hands folded and his eyes politely averted. Gerald set the mug down. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Kang with those level, dark eyes, the ones that had always seen too clearly, and waited. Kang had prepared for tears. For accusations. For the particular sharp fury that Gerald was capable of when something mattered enough to crack his composure. He had not prepared for the quiet. It made the next words harder to say, and so he said them faster. I need you to leave, Gerald. A beat. 2. Kang. Just his name. One word. The full weight of 3 years folded inside it. This isn't something I'm willing to argue about. Kang moved to the door and held it open. Behind him, Shinru remained motionless in the hallway, young, well-dressed, from a family whose connections Kang had been quietly cultivating for 8 months. The kind of Omega who would open doors rather than challenge the men standing in front of them. Kang had told himself that was practical. That Gerald's independence, the same quality that had drawn him in years ago, had simply become friction. Brilliant people were everywhere. Strategic people were rarer. He believed that. He had worked very hard to believe it. Gerald didn't move for a long moment. He looked at Kang's hand on the door frame. He looked at Shinru. He looked, finally, back at Kang, and whatever he found there, or didn't find, must have confirmed everything, because something shifted behind his eyes. Not collapse. Something quieter and more permanent than that. He walked to the bedroom. Returned in under 4 minutes with his coat, his work bag, and the small leather wallet he kept on the nightstand. He didn't take anything else. 3 years of accumulated living, his books stacked on the lower shelves, his architectural models in the corner, the framed print above the desk he had picked out on their first weekend together. All of it left exactly where it was. At the door he stopped. Not to beg. Gerald Shin did not beg. He stopped the way a person stops when they want to remember a face accurately, without sentiment distorting it. Then he walked out. Kang closed the door. The rain had been falling for 2 hours by the time Gerald reached the bottom of the apartment steps. He stood on the pavement and looked at his phone. Dead, the battery warning he had ignored all evening finally making good on its threat. He opened his wallet. 12,001. His transit card. A receipt from a coffee shop near his office, dated 3 days ago, folded in half. He started walking. He didn't know where. He only knew that standing still felt impossible, and that the cold was better than the alternative, going back up those stairs, pressing his ear to that door, hearing the sounds of a life that had just been rewritten without him. So he walked. Mapo streets at midnight were nearly empty, the rain clearing even the convenience store crowd. His coat was soaked through inside of 10 minutes. He didn't notice. He was doing the arithmetic of 3 years in his head, trying to find the moment it had turned, the exact hairline fracture he had chosen, again and again, not to name. He was still calculating when the street ended and the intersection began. He was still calculating when the headlights appeared. The meeting had run 4 hours longer than scheduled, which meant Jang Choi was in the kind of mood that made his men study the floor of the SUV with great personal interest. He sat in the back seat with one hand resting on the window ledge and his eyes on the passing city, not speaking. He rarely spoke in transit. His second-in-command, Wu Tai-san, had learned in his 3rd week of employment that silence from Jang Choi was not an invitation to fill, it was a perimeter, and crossing it uninvited carried specific consequences. So the 3 men in that vehicle rode through Mapo's rain-slick streets in practiced quiet, the only sound the wiper blades and the low frequency of the radio Tai-san kept at a volume that could barely be called volume at all. Choi was thinking about the meeting. About the Busan faction's latest show of bad faith and the particular way their representative had smiled while lying. Too much upper teeth, not enough stillness in the eyes. He had catalogued it. He would use it later. He was not thinking about the intersection. Then Tai-san said sir, and hit the brakes, and the world outside the windshield became suddenly, violently complicated. The impact was minor by the mathematics of physics, a glancing clip, the SUV already slowing as Tai-san reacted, the body rolling rather than taking the full force. But a body was a body, and it went down hard on wet asphalt, and for 1 suspended second the only sound was rain. Tai-san had his hand on his phone before the vehicle fully stopped. I'll call? Choi's door was already open. He stepped out without a word, without hesitation, without the fraction of a second calculation that most men in his position would have performed. The calculation that weighed exposure against liability, witnesses against influence, the cleanliness of a hospital call against the complications of personal involvement. His men ran that calculation. They ran it very quickly, watching him cross the wet road in a suit that cost more than some of their monthly salaries, and none of them said anything, because Jang Choi had already crouched down next to the body on the asphalt and none of them had ever seen him do that for anyone. The Omega was young. Dark hair plastered to his forehead by rain. A gray sweater soaked completely through. He was conscious, barely, breath coming in the short, disoriented pulse of someone whose body was starting to tally its damage. There was a gash above his left temple where his head had caught the corner of the license plate, and blood was tracking down through the rain in dilute ribbons, and his eyes were open but losing their focus with the particular slowness of someone beginning to drift. "Hey." Choi's voice came out low and even. He pulled off his suit jacket, not quickly, but without ceremony, folded it once, and pressed it firmly against the wound. "Look at me." The Omega's eyes moved to his face. Dark eyes. Precise, even now. Trying, even now, to make sense of what they were seeing. "Don't close your eyes. I need you to stay right here." Up close, Choi registered details without deciding to. The calluses on the man's right hand, drafting or design work, something manual and skilled. The leather bag still strapped across his body, protected even unconsciously. The absence of a bonding mark on his neck. The way he was not, despite everything, making a single sound of distress, jaw set, breath controlled, some deep and apparently immovable sense of composure holding even as his body gave out underneath it. Tai-san appeared at Choi's shoulder. "Boss. I can have an ambulance here in 4 minutes. We can be gone in 3. Choi didn't look up. "Take him to the penthouse." A silence that carried considerable weight. "Sir, if he's seriously injured, a hospital would be. Call Dr. Yun. Tell him grade 2 concussion, possible rib fractures, head laceration. Tell him to be there when we arrive." Choi finally looked up at Tai-san, and whatever Tai-san found in that look resolved his hesitation immediately. "And get me something dry for his head. Now." They moved. They always moved when he used that particular tone. Choi looked back down at the Omega, who was watching him with an expression that was difficult to read, not fear, which would have been reasonable. Not gratitude, which would have been premature. Something more like assessment. Even bleeding on wet asphalt in the rain at midnight, this man was looking at Jang Choi the way people looked at architectural plans, checking load-bearing walls. It was, unexpectedly, the most interesting thing Choi had seen all week. "What's your name?" he asked. Not for medical reasons. He wasn't sure why he asked. The Omega's mouth moved. "Gerald." A pause, breath careful. "Gerald Shin." "Gerald." Choi pressed the jacket more firmly against the wound. "I'm going to get you somewhere warm and get your head looked at. After that, I'll answer whatever questions you have. But right now I need you to keep your eyes open." Gerald Shin looked at him for a long moment. Then, with what appeared to be considerable effort and even more considerable deliberateness, he said, "You hit me with your car." "I know. That was your fault." "Yes." Then, his breath hitched once, sharp. "Ribs. I have a lot of questions." "I know," Choi said again. And for the first time all night, something that was not quite a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "Stay awake long enough to ask them." Gerald had always understood structures. Not just the physical kind, though those too, the load-bearing logic of beams and foundations, the way a building's integrity lived in its bones long before its surface told you anything. He understood the structure of things in a broader sense. The hidden framework beneath visible form. The difference between what something looked like and what it was actually doing. It was, therefore, a particular and personal humiliation that he had spent 3 years living inside a lie he had designed himself and called it a home. He had entered Yonsei University's architecture program at 19 as the only openly unsuppressed Omega in his cohort. This was not a political statement, though people treated it as one. It was simpler than that. Suppressants made Gerald's hands imprecise. A slight tremor, barely perceptible to anyone else, but enough that his drafting lines lost the quality he demanded from them. He had weighed the trade-off at 17, made his decision, and never revisited it. His professors had concerns. His classmates had opinions. Gerald had his work, which by his second year was consistently the best in the room, and he found that excellence, maintained without apology, had a way of eventually boring people out of their objections. He graduated top of his cohort at 23. The photograph from that day still existed somewhere in a drawer in the Mapo apartment. Gerald in his gown, holding his award, his expression not triumphant but quietly, specifically satisfied, the way a person looks when something they built holds exactly the weight it was designed to hold. He met Kang Doyun 4 months later, at a mutual friend's rooftop gathering in Hongdae. Kang was in finance. Sharp, social, with the particular magnetism of someone who made every room feel like it had been waiting for him. He was alpha, which Gerald registered and promptly filed as irrelevant. He had never organized his world around designation and saw no reason to start. What caught him was something else. They had been talking for an hour when Kang said, almost offhandedly, "I've never met anyone who doesn't need to be saved." He meant it as a compliment. Gerald understood that. What he perhaps failed to interrogate was what the statement revealed about the man saying it, that Kang's model of connection was built around rescue, around the particular satisfaction of being necessary, around the sustaining belief that the people he loved required him. Gerald didn't require anyone. He should have recognized, then, that this was a foundation with a flaw built in. He was an architect. He knew what happened when you built on compromised ground. Instead he thought, finally, someone who sees me clearly. And he let himself fall. The first year was genuine. He would stake his professional precision on that. It was real. Kang learned how Gerald took his coffee without being asked. Gerald went to Kang's firm dinners and was charming in the way that required considerable private effort from someone of Gerald's temperament, because it mattered to Kang and things that mattered to Kang mattered to Gerald. They built something together. Not perfect, but honest. The kind of relationship that makes you revise downward your expectations of everything that came before it. The fractures, when they came, were hairline. Invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The first one, Gerald's design for a mixed-use complex in Sea Demon, was shortlisted for a regional award. He came home with the news and Kang said that's great without looking up from his phone, and the conversation moved on, and Gerald told himself that was nothing. Kang was tired. It meant nothing. The second, a firm dinner where a senior partner spent 20 minutes asking Gerald questions about urban zoning philosophy, and Gerald answered, and the conversation was the best one he'd had in months, and on the walk home Kang was quiet in a way that had a temperature to it, cold and specific, and when Gerald asked what was wrong, Kang said nothing in a tone that meant everything but dared him to press. Gerald didn't press. He had never been someone who forced doors open. He respected closed things. The third, a Tuesday night, 8 months before the end, when he woke at 2 a.m. and reached across the bed and found it empty. Kang was on the couch with his phone. He said he couldn't sleep. Gerald went back to bed, lay in the dark and listened to the quality of the silence and told himself, with all the careful deliberateness of a man constructing an argument he doesn't quite believe, that it meant nothing. He was not naive. He had understood, by then, that something was wrong. What he had chosen, instead of naming it, was hope. The belief that what they had built was strong enough to absorb the stress, that the fractures were surface level, that if he just held his position and didn't panic the structure would stabilize. He was an architect who had forgotten the first principle he'd ever been taught. A flaw you don't address doesn't disappear. It travels down. It finds the foundation. And it waits. The thing about slow damage is that it teaches you to normalize itself. It doesn't arrive as catastrophe. It arrives as a Tuesday. As a comment at dinner that lands slightly wrong and is never addressed. As a door that used to be open, now habitually closed. You adjust. You recalibrate. You tell yourself the discomfort is yours to manage, a personal failing of perception, and you get very good at making that argument because the alternative, that the person you chose is deliberately making you smaller, is a truth with consequences you're not yet ready to pay. Gerald Shin was one of the most structurally rigorous thinkers he knew. He reasoned his way through 8 months of quiet demolition and called it patience. It began with his work. In February, Gerald was asked to lead the junior team on a commercial renovation project in Yongsan, a significant step, the kind that announced professional arrival. He told Kang over dinner. Kang listened, nodded, and said, "Just don't let it consume you. You get tunnel vision when you're obsessed with something." It was framed as concern. Gerald received it as concern. It was only later, much later, that he would replay that sentence and understand it for what it actually was, the first deliberate installation of doubt. Not "I'm proud of you." Not "tell me about it." Instead, a quiet suggestion that Gerald's greatest professional strength was a liability requiring management. He thanked Kang for the perspective. By April, it had become a pattern. Every milestone Gerald reached was met not with hostility. Kang was too controlled for hostility, but with a particular brand of measured dampening. Don't get ahead of yourself. The industry is competitive, don't read too much into one project. You work so hard, but you have to wonder if you're compensating for something. Each statement individually defensible as honest concern from a partner. Collectively, they were something else. They were a sustained, methodical effort to ensure that Gerald Shin never fully occupied the space his talent had earned. Gerald noticed. He filed it. He said nothing. Shin-Roo appeared in Kang's schedule in March, though Gerald didn't have a name for him until May. He was the son of a director at a mid-sized investment firm that Kang's company had been quietly courting, young, 22, from the kind of family that collected connections the way other people collected furniture. Gerald found out about him the way you find out about most things when someone is being careful, in fragments. A name in a message notification, glimpsed without intention. A restaurant receipt in Kang's jacket pocket for a dinner that had not been mentioned. The specific way Kang began checking his phone with his screen angled away. Gerald assembled the fragments. He did not present them. He did not construct an accusation from them, did not rehearse the confrontation, did not do any of the things that would have forced the truth into the room where both of them would have to deal with it. He chose, instead, to believe that he was wrong. This was not stupidity. It was something more costly than that. Gerald had invested 3 years into this relationship, 3 years of dinners and compromises and showing up to firm events and learning to need someone in the specific quiet way that private people allow themselves to need. The price of being wrong about Kang was the price of having been wrong about himself. About his own judgment, his own vision, the carefully constructed framework of a life he had believed in. He was not ready to pay that. So he held the evidence loosely. He gave Kang room he didn't deserve. He worked longer hours and told himself the distance between them was circumstantial, seasonal, a phase with a natural end. June. July. August. Kang stopped reaching for him in the night. Stopped asking about his projects. Started coming home with Shin-Roo scent embedded in his clothes so consistently that Gerald eventually stopped registering it as information and simply absorbed it as a new and terrible feature of his daily life. In August, Gerald submitted his See a Demon design for the regional award, the same project Kang had quietly discouraged. It won. He came home and put the certificate in his work bag and said nothing about it over dinner, and that silence, he understood even then, was the first thing he had done in months purely to protect himself. He wasn't ready. But he was close. He woke slowly. The first thing he registered was the ceiling, high, unfamiliar, the particular white of a room with serious architecture behind its simplicity. Then sheets, clean and cool against skin that felt like it had been through something. Then a low, steady ache across his ribs that tightened sharply when he tried to move. He lay still. The scent in the room was alpha, contained, not aggressive, present the way a banked fire is present. Nothing he recognized. Nothing with memory attached to it. Which meant, on some level his waking mind was still assembling, that he was somewhere entirely new. He was alive. He ran that fact through his mind once. Then again. He had walked into an intersection in the rain and he was lying in a bed with high ceilings and clean sheets and the distant sound of a city that was going on without him, and he was alive. Gerald Shin closed his eyes. And for the first time in 8 months, he let himself exhale all the way down. Gerald's first coherent act upon waking was to ask where he was. His second was to demand to leave. Dr. Yun, a compact, unhurried man in his 50s who had clearly long since stopped being surprised by anything that happened in this penthouse, explained calmly that Gerald had a grade 2 concussion, 3 fractured ribs on his left side, and a laceration above his temple that had required 6 stitches in the early hours of the morning. He delivered this information the way someone reads a weather report, accurate, thorough, and entirely free of drama. Gerald listened to all of it. Then he said, "I'd like to be transferred to a public hospital." Dr. Yun looked at him with the particular patience of a man who had been asked unreasonable things by difficult people for 30 years. "That is not my decision." "Whose decision is it?" The answer arrived 12 minutes later. Jang Choi filled a doorframe the way certain buildings fill the skyline, not by being decorative, but by being undeniable. He was still dressed, though it was past 3 in the morning, the suit jacket gone but everything else intact, his white shirt open at the collar in a way that made the lower edge of his neck tattoo visible, dark, intricate, the kind of work that takes hours and means something. Silver watch on his left wrist. Eyes that assessed without announcing themselves. He looked at Gerald the way Gerald had looked at him from the asphalt, directly, without performance, and pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. "You want to go to a public hospital," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." "Why?" Gerald found the question genuinely irritating. "Because I don't know you. Because I'm in your home without having chosen to be. Because accepting this," he gestured at the room, the immaculate sheets, the medical equipment that had no business being in a private residence, "from a stranger creates an obligation I haven't agreed to." Choi was quiet for a moment. "Then, you have a grade 2 concussion and 3 fractured ribs. Walk out if you want. I won't chase you." Gerald opened his mouth. Closed it. It was such a profoundly unexpected response that it took him several seconds to process it. Not permission exactly, and not indifference either, but something rarer, a complete and genuine respect for his autonomy, offered without negotiation, without the subtle emotional pressure that most people applied when they wanted you to stay and were pretending they didn't. Kang had been an expert at that particular pressure. Gerald had lived inside it for years without fully naming it. This was nothing like that. "I won't chase you," Choi repeated, "but Dr. Yun will tell you what walking out means for your recovery, and I'll listen while he does, and then whatever you decide is your business." Dr. Yun told him. Thoroughly. Gerald stayed. He attempted to leave twice more over the following 3 days, on both occasions fully dressed and at the front door before his ribs made the argument that logic had failed to make. Choi's men, a rotating presence of large, quiet individuals who communicated primarily through professional stillness, stepped aside both times without comment. The door was never locked. This detail bothered Gerald more than a lock would have, because it removed every narrative in which he was being kept somewhere, and left him only with the truth. He was choosing to stay because his body required it, and the man whose home this was had structured the entire situation so that the choice remained Gerald's. It was a form of power Gerald hadn't encountered before. He didn't entirely trust it. But he noted it with the same precision he noted everything. On the second day, Choi's phone rang during the hour he spent each evening in the chair by Gerald's window, a habit that had established itself without discussion, Choi reviewing documents in silence while Gerald read or slept or stared at the ceiling performing architectural calculations in his head to stay sane. Choi glanced at the screen, declined the call, and set the phone face down. Gerald recognized the number prefix. Mapo District. He said nothing. What Kang Do-yoon did, upon learning where Gerald was not driven by guilt. Guilt would have required a version of events in which Kang acknowledged his own role clearly enough to feel its weight. Instead, what Kang experienced was the particular cold panic of a man whose narrative is escaping his control. Gerald, quiet, competent, professionally rising Gerald, was apparently alive and recovering inside the private residence of Jang Choi. That name, even at the periphery of Kang's social world, carried a specific gravity. People would ask questions. People would look at the timeline, the expulsion, the accident, the penthouse. The story would not reflect well. So Kang began, with quiet efficiency, to write a different one. It moved through their social circle in the way these things always moved, not as accusation, which could be challenged, but as concern. A word here, a carefully weighted pause there. Gerald had been struggling for months. The pressure of work, you know how he gets. I tried to help but he wouldn't let anyone in. Honestly, I'd been worried about his stability for a long time. The breakdown it wasn't entirely a surprise. By the third day, 6 people who considered themselves Gerald's friends believed a version of him that Gerald would not have recognized. None of them had called to check. Park Sumin arrived on the 4th day with 2 containers of Xiaoliangtang, a phone charger, and the expression of someone who had been rehearsing what they were about to say for the entire length of the drive over. She was Gerald's closest friend, had been since their 2nd year at Yonsei, when they pulled consecutive all-nighters on a structural design project and discovered they had the same specific and exacting standards for work and the same complete intolerance for people who didn't. She was sharp, loyal, and constitutionally incapable of softening information to the point of uselessness. These were qualities Gerald had always valued in her. Today they were going to cost him something. She sat across from him, noted the stitches and the careful way he held his left side, and said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to actually listen instead of going quiet and telling me you're fine." Gerald set down his soup. "Tell me." She told him. It took 11 minutes. Sumin was thorough. She had, characteristically, gathered information before coming, cross-referenced sources, separated confirmed accounts from speculation. She laid it out with the precision of someone presenting structural evidence, and Gerald listened to all of it without moving. The version of himself that Kang was circulating was almost elegant in its construction. Not a villain, Kang was too smart for that, too aware that accusations invited counter-accusations. Instead, Gerald had been reframed as a casualty. A brilliant but brittle person whose instability had made the relationship impossible. Someone Kang had tried, patiently and at considerable personal cost, to support, until the weight of it became untenable. The breakdown, in Kang's version, was not a consequence of being thrown out in the rain. It was the confirmation of a pattern. The inevitable result of a fragility that had always been there. 6 people believed it. Possibly more. One of their former colleagues had apparently responded with, "I always thought there was something a little off about him." Summon finished. The room was very quiet. Gerald sat with his hands flat on the blanket in front of him and looked at a point on the wall across the room and said nothing for a period of time that Summon later described as the longest 90 seconds of her professional life. Then he said, "He used my silence against me." "Yes," Summon said. "I think he did. Everything I didn't say. Every time I absorbed something and moved on without making it an incident. He took all of that and reframed it as evidence. Gerald. He built the lie out of my dignity." His voice was level. Completely, precisely level, which Summon recognized as more alarming than any raised volume would have been. He used the fact that I don't perform my pain as proof that I'm unstable. He stopped. Pressed his thumb briefly against the inside of his wrist, a private habit Summon had noticed over years of friendship, the gesture he used when he was locating his own center. That's a very specific kind of cruelty. She didn't try to comfort him. She knew him well enough not to. She just sat there and let him be furious in the contained, architectural way that Gerald Shin was furious, not explosion, but compression, a force finding its load-bearing points, deciding precisely where to apply pressure. After a moment he said, "I need to make a call." He didn't make a call. He waited. That evening, when Choi came to the doorway of the room in his habitual way, not entering without invitation, another detail Gerald had catalogued, Gerald looked at him directly and said, "I need to ask you for something." Choi came in. Sat down. "Kang is telling people I had a breakdown," Gerald said. "He's telling them I was unstable. That the relationship failed because of me. He's doing it carefully enough that it reads as concern rather than slander, which means I can't challenge it directly without looking like exactly what he's describing." A pause. "I need to know what I'm walking back into." Choi looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking me to find out what is said and to whom." "I'm asking you," Gerald said, with a precision that cost him something, "to help me understand the landscape. Not to act on it. Just, I need to see it clearly." "All right," Choi said. Just that. No performance of generosity. No suggestion that Gerald should feel grateful or relieved. Just a simple, immediate acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge something that requires no deliberation because the answer was never in question. It took 48 hours. What Choi's network produced was not retribution. It was documentation. Every conversation Kang had seeded, recorded through channels Gerald chose not to examine too closely. Every person he had spoken to, identified. The precise language used in each version of the story, laid out with enough variation to show deliberate calibration. Kang had adjusted the narrative for different audiences, which demonstrated premeditation. The correction moved through the same social network, via the same informal architecture of conversation and implication, carrying the same quiet authority, except in the opposite direction. Not a counter-accusation. Simply the facts, placed precisely where the lies had been, with enough supporting detail to make the lies structurally unsound. Within 2 days, the narrative collapsed. Gerald read the summary Choi's team prepared and sat with it in silence for a long time. The efficiency of it. The comprehensiveness. The complete absence of violence or visible force, just information, deployed like a precision instrument, dismantling exactly what needed dismantling and nothing else. He looked up at Choi, who was standing at the window with his back partly turned, giving Gerald the space to process privately. "You're very good at this," Gerald said. Choi turned slightly. "Yes. I don't know yet," Gerald said carefully, whether that should reassure me or frighten me. Choi's expression didn't change. But something in it acknowledged the honesty of the question with what might, in another man, have been called respect. Both, he said, is probably the accurate answer. Gerald chose a Wednesday morning. Not for any symbolic reason. He was not, by nature, a symbolic thinker. He chose it because Wednesdays Kang had a standing 11 o'clock meeting downtown that historically ran until 1, which meant the apartment would most likely be empty, which meant Gerald could retrieve what was his without the retrieval becoming something else. He was wrong about the apartment being empty. He had accounted for Kang's schedule and not for the fact that Kang, in the 2 weeks since the expulsion, had stopped behaving predictably. But that came later. Choi drove him personally. Gerald had not asked for this, had, in fact, said clearly that he could manage the trip alone, that he was physically recovered enough, that a car service would be sufficient. Choi had listened to all of this and then said, "I'll drive you," in the tone that was not a command but was also not negotiable, and Gerald had looked at him for a moment and decided that some arguments had a cost-to-benefit ratio that didn't justify themselves. They didn't speak much on the way over. Gerald sat with a list in his head, ordered by priority, as he ordered everything. Architectural portfolio in the flat storage drawer beneath the drafting table. 3 external hard drives in the second desk drawer, left side. The ring in the small cedarwood box on the bedroom windowsill, where it had sat for the entirety of his relationship with Kang because Kang had never once asked about it and Gerald had never offered. His grandmother's ring. The one thing in that apartment that had belonged to his life before Kang. He had left everything else behind on the night of the expulsion. The books, the print, 3 years of accumulated living, but the ring was not negotiable. He had simply been in too much shock that night to think clearly enough to take it. He was thinking clearly now. The door opened on the second knock. Not Kang. Shin Roo, in a shirt that Gerald recognized as Kang's, holding a cup of coffee, his expression moving through surprise and then something less comfortable when he registered Gerald's face. He was younger than Gerald had imagined. 22, perhaps. Soft around the edges in a way that wasn't his fault and that Gerald had no interest in holding against him. "I'm here for my things," Gerald said. "I'll be 20 minutes. Shin-Roo stepped back. Gerald walked in. The apartment looked the same. This was somehow worse than if it had been changed. The same furniture, the same light through the same windows, his architectural models still in the corner where he'd left them, gathering 2 weeks of dust in a home that had already stopped being his before he walked out of it. He went to the drafting table first. Opened the flat storage drawer. The portfolio was there, undisturbed, 40-odd pages of project work representing 3 years of professional development, the physical record of everything he'd built while Kang was quietly suggesting he was building too ambitiously. He set it by the door. Moved to the desk. He was sliding the third hard drive into his bag when he heard the front door. Kang took in the scene in the particular way of someone who has been caught off guard and is processing it as a threat. His eyes moved from Gerald to the portfolio by the door to Choi, who had come in behind Gerald and was now standing near the entrance with his hands in his jacket pockets, occupying the space with that specific quality of stillness that seemed to lower the temperature of any room he was in. Something moved across Kang's face. Gerald had known that face for 3 years and he recognized the sequence. Surprise, then calculation, then the rapid construction of a posture. Gerald. Kang. Gerald crossed to the bedroom without stopping. The cedarwood box was on the windowsill where he'd left it. He opened it, confirmed the ring was there, and put it in his jacket's inner pocket, close to his chest. Then he stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment and looked at the room with the deliberate finality of someone closing a file they will not reopen. When he came back out, Kang was standing in the middle of the living room. Shin-Roo had retreated to the kitchen. Choi hadn't moved. "You didn't have to come here like this," Kang said. "You could have called. I would have sent your things." "I prefer to collect what's mine myself," Gerald said. He picked up the portfolio. Adjusted the strap of his bag. "Gerald." Something different in Kang's voice now, not authority, not the measured dampening Gerald had lived under for 8 months. Something that sounded almost like urgency. "We should talk. Properly." Without, his eyes moved briefly to Choi, an audience. "We don't have anything to talk about. You're staying with him." The urgency sharpening into something rawer. "You're living in his home. Do you know what he is? What he does?" "Gerald, You don't belong with someone like him. Gerald stopped. He looked down at Kang's hand on his arm, the grip firm, the knuckles slightly white, the first uncontrolled thing Kang Do-yoon had done in Gerald's presence in longer than he could remember. He looked at it with the same precise attention he gave structural problems. Locating the stress point. Understanding what the crack revealed about what lay beneath. Then he looked up at Kang's face. What he found there was not love. It might once have been, or something close enough to it that the difference hadn't mattered. What it was now was need, the specific, anxious need of a man who had discarded something and found, too late, that its absence had altered the architecture of everything around it. Gerald's voice, when it came, was quiet. Completely quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't require volume because it has weight instead. You should have thought about that, he said, before you opened the door. He removed Kang's hand from his arm. Not roughly, just clearly. With the same deliberate precision with which he did everything that mattered. He walked to the front door. Choi fell into step beside him without a word. Without a glance back at Kang. Without any gesture that acknowledged the confrontation as something requiring a response, because it didn't, because Gerald had already said everything, and anything Choi might have added would only have diminished it. They stepped out into the corridor. The door closed behind them. In the elevator, going down, Gerald stood with his portfolio under his arm and his grandmother's ring pressing gently against his chest through the fabric of his jacket, and looked straight ahead at the elevator doors, and said nothing. Choi stood beside him and said nothing. The elevator descended. Somewhere above them, in a maple apartment that smelled of the wrong omega and the slow rot of a miscalculation, Kang Do-yoon stood in his living room with a grip on nothing. Gerald moved his things into the east-facing guest room on a Thursday afternoon, and the first thing he did was test the lock. Not because he expected to need it. He understood, by now, that Choi was not a man who took things, that the entire architecture of how Choi had managed his presence in this penthouse had been built around the principle of offering without demanding, of making space without filling it uninvited. Gerald understood this intellectually, had catalogued it with the same precision he catalogued everything. He locked the door anyway. And then, because it mattered that the choice was his, he unlocked it again. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment, his portfolio against the wall, his hard drives on the desk, the cedarwood box on the windowsill where it had always lived best, in light, and took a full breath. His ribs were mostly healed. The stitches above his temple had been removed 4 days ago, leaving a thin line that Dr. Yun said would fade to almost nothing within the year. He was not here because he had nowhere else to go. Summon had offered her spare room with characteristic directness and zero emotional conditions attached. He had considered it seriously, which was how he considered everything. He had chosen this instead. He had not yet fully examined why. What Choi offered did not announce itself. That was the thing Gerald kept returning to in the weeks that followed, the complete absence of performance. There were no grand gestures calibrated to impress. No demonstration of resources, though the resources were evident and considerable. No moments engineered to make Gerald feel the specific gratitude that creates obligation. There was coffee. Gerald took his black, slightly over-extracted, in a wide ceramic mug rather than the narrow cups most people used. He had mentioned this once, in passing, during his 4th day of recovery, a peripheral comment about the penthouse's automatic machine defaulting to espresso. The next morning there was a different setup in the kitchen. Wide ceramic mug. The grind adjusted. Nothing said about it. There was the drafting light. He had started working again in his 2nd week in the East Room. Nothing ambitious, just the smaller projects that his firm had been holding, the kind of focused technical work that his mind needed the way his body needed movement. He kept late hours. The light in his room, visible under the door, apparently registered to someone because he began to find, on the nights he worked past midnight, that the kitchen had been quietly stocked with the specific tea he'd bought once and replaced without being asked, and that the corridor light was always left on low so that the walk from his room to the kitchen didn't require fumbling for switches in the dark. Nothing was said about any of it. Gerald noticed everything. He said nothing for a long time, because he was doing what he always did with structures he didn't yet fully understand, observing load behavior before drawing conclusions. The change came incrementally, the way real changes always came. He started leaving his door open when he worked. A small thing, almost architectural, an adjustment in the boundary of the space he occupied, allowing the sounds of the penthouse in. The low register of Choi's calls from the study. The particular stillness of late evenings when the city below softened and the building breathed differently. He told himself it was because the open door improved air circulation. He started staying for the evenings Choi spent in the main room, not joining exactly, maintaining his own work or his own reading, but being present in the same space without the deliberate distance he'd maintained in the early weeks. Choi never remarked on this. Never adjusted his behavior to acknowledge it, never leaned into the proximity. He simply continued being what he had always been in Gerald's presence. Contained, consistent, requiring nothing. Gerald, who had spent 3 years with a man whose emotional temperature he had constantly monitored and managed, found this disorienting. Then restful. Then, in a way he examined with considerable private suspicion, necessary. He was not naive about what was happening. He was an architect. He understood when a structure was shifting. What he didn't know was what to do about it, because every model of desire he had was built on the premise that it came with calculation underneath, that being wanted meant being assessed, that closeness was a negotiation with fine print. He had accepted that as the nature of things. He had built his walls accordingly. Choi's consistency made the walls feel, for the first time, less like protection and more like habit. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after Gerald had moved his things into the East Room, when it happened. They were at the kitchen table. Gerald had pushed his project drawings to one side to eat. Choi had closed his laptop. The city was dark beyond the windows. They had been sharing meals with increasing regularity, another incremental shift that had established itself without discussion. Choi looked at him across the table for a moment in the particular way he had, direct, undemanding, as though looking at Gerald was something he did for its own sake and not because he wanted anything from it. Then he said, "You don't have to decide anything." Gerald went still. "About any of it," Choi continued, his voice at its usual register, low, even, carrying the unhurried quality of someone who had thought about what they were saying and meant all of it. "What this is. What you want. Whether you stay or go. I'm not building anything that requires an answer from you." A pause. "I'm not going anywhere." Gerald looked at him. At the steadiness of him. The same steadiness that had held a folded suit jacket against his head in the rain, that had said walk out if you want and meant it, that had dismantled Kang's lies not to demonstrate power but because Gerald had needed to see clearly and Choi had simply made that possible. He thought about all the things he had never said. All the silences he'd maintained to keep the peace, the pain he'd absorbed to avoid confrontation, the long quiet architecture of a man who had learned to need people privately and mourn them the same way. He thought about the lock on his door that he tested every night and never actually used. The pause stretched out between them, long enough that the city seemed to hold its breath with it. Then Gerald reached across the table. Not dramatically. Not with declaration. Just his hand, crossing the space between them, coming to rest over Choi's on the table, deliberate and quiet and entirely, for the first time in longer than he could remember, chosen without reservation. Choi turned his hand over. Held on. Neither of them said anything. Outside, Seoul carried on in its vast and indifferent way, all light and motion and the sound of a city that had never once paused for anyone's heartbreak. But in the penthouse kitchen, at a table with project drawings pushed to one side, something that had been a long time building finally settled into its foundation. And it held. 6 months is not a long time in the life of a city. Seoul doesn't mark it. The Han River doesn't pause. The streets of Mapo and Yongsan and Gangnam go on doing what they have always done, generating and consuming, building and demolishing, moving forward with the vast civic indifference of a place too large and too old to register individual recoveries. But 6 months is enough time to build a foundation. Gerald Shin knew this better than most. The presentation was at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a development company's Uedo offices, and Gerald had been ready since 8:15. Not anxious ready. Not the performance of readiness that masks uncertainty. Actually ready, the kind that lives in the body, in hands that know their material, in a voice that has nothing to prove and therefore nothing to hide. He stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit with his grandmother's ring on his right hand, its small weight familiar and grounding, and he presented 6 months of work with the precision and confidence of someone who had built every argument in the room personally and stress-tested each one. Park Sumin sat to his left with the technical drawings, fielding questions about structural specifications with the same focused economy she brought to everything. Their firm, Shin Summon Architecture, registered 4 months ago in a Mapo office space that smelled of fresh paint and possibility, had been handed this commission as a long shot. A mixed-use residential and cultural complex in Seongdong-GU. 42 units, a public gallery space, a rooftop garden system. The kind of project that announced arrival. The lead developer asked 7 questions. Gerald answered all 7 without consulting his notes. At 11:40, the developer looked at his colleagues, then back at Gerald, and said, "We'd like to move forward." Summon, to her credit, waited until they were in the elevator before she made a sound. Then she grabbed Gerald's arm with both hands and said something high-pitched and unprofessional that Gerald would never repeat and that he would remember for the rest of his life. He laughed. Fully, without reservation, the kind of laugh that had been a long time returning. Across the city, in a different kind of meeting, Kang Do-yoon was sitting across from a company lawyer in a conference room that had stopped feeling like his territory approximately 3 weeks ago. The embezzlement investigation had begun quietly, as these things always did, a flag in a quarterly audit, a discrepancy that led to another discrepancy, a thread that someone had pulled and found connected to a much larger unraveling. The amounts were not small. The paper trail, apparently, was not as clean as Kang had believed. His company's board had placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, which was the corporate equivalent of a door held open with cold eyes and a flat expression. He sat in that conference room and listened to the lawyer outline his options and thought, with the specific detachment of a man whose emotional resources had been running on deficit for months, that he had spent years calculating other people's structural weaknesses without adequately auditing his own. Shinru had left in March. Not dramatically, there had been no confrontation, no scene. Shinru was, as Gerald had assessed in one brief glance, a young man whose softness was not weakness but practicality, and practically speaking, an alpha under financial investigation with a cooling professional reputation and a penthouse that increasingly felt like the set of a life rather than the life itself was not a compelling long-term prospect. He had moved back to his family's apartment in Bundang and within 2 weeks was photographed at a Gangnam charity event standing next to a vice president at a securities firm, smiling with the uncomplicated brightness of someone who had made a clean decision and felt good about it. Kang had no one to be angry at. He had engineered this outcome himself, piece by deliberate piece, and the architecture of his own calculation had turned out to be precisely as load-bearing as he deserved. The social circle, the same one he had seeded with the quiet story about Gerald's instability, had gone notably silent. Not hostile. Silence was worse. The particular silence of people who have quietly revised their assessment of a situation and are waiting to see which way it finally falls before committing to a position. What Kang understood now, sitting across from a lawyer in a room that used to feel like an extension of his authority, was the precise nature of what he had discarded. Not Gerald's softness. Gerald had no softness to discard. What he had thrown out into the rain that midnight was the most structurally sound person he had ever known. The kind of person who built things that held. The kind of quiet, load-bearing presence whose absence you didn't feel immediately, you felt it later, when everything around it started to shift. He had opened the door himself. He had no one to blame for what came through it afterward. Gerald got back to the penthouse at 2:30. Choi was in the study when he came in, on a call, the door ajar, his voice at its usual low and unhurried register. Gerald set his bag down in the entryway, took off his jacket, and went to the kitchen to make tea with the ease of someone who has learned a space and been learned by it in return. He could hear the city through the balcony doors, Seoul in the early afternoon, that particular frequency of traffic and wind and urban permanence. When Choi appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, Gerald looked at him and said, "We got the commission." Choi's expression didn't transform into performance. It did something quieter and more genuine, a settling, a warmth that moved through his eyes like something that had been waiting and was now released. "I know," he said. "Someone sent a message." Gerald looked at him. Of course she did. She also sent approximately 11 exclamation marks. That sounds right. They took their tea to the balcony as the afternoon began its slow turn toward evening. Seoul arranged itself below them in its usual extravagant indifference, all light and density and the accumulated ambition of 10 million people going about their particular business. Gerald stood at the railing for a while, his grandmother's ring catching the late light, and looked at the city he had chosen and that had, in its chaotic and impersonal way, given him back more than it had taken. Choi stood beside him. Not speaking. Not needing to. After a while Gerald turned, set his mug on the railing, and leaned back against Choi's chest. The arms that came around him did so without urgency, steady, present, asking nothing. The way everything with Choi asked nothing. Gerald felt the solidity of him. The warmth. The specific and unhurried certainty of someone who had said I'm not going anywhere and had meant it in every way a person could mean something. He had been held before. He had tolerated it, accepted it, occasionally needed it in the private way he needed most things, quietly and without announcement. But this was different, and he knew precisely why, because he was a man who understood structures and he understood this one now with complete clarity. He was not here because he was lost. He was not here because he had been broken and someone had gathered the pieces. He was here because he had rebuilt himself, from the ground up, load-bearing wall by load-bearing wall, and then looked around at the finished structure of his life and made a clear-eyed, fully conscious, entirely voluntary decision about who he wanted standing in it. The distinction was everything. For the first time in longer than he could measure, that distinction belonged entirely to him. Below them, Seoul burned on, bright and enormous and completely indifferent to the quiet revolution happening on one penthouse balcony, where a man who had walked out of his own life with 12,000 Korean wons and a dead phone was leaning into something real, not because he needed to be held, but because he wanted to be. And wanting something on his own terms, freely and without apology. That had always been the only home Gerald Shin ever needed.